Greetings, and welcome to Along Came a Podcast. I'm your host, Rich, and today's episode is about Days of Future Past. Are you tired of hearing what a great movie this is, and how everybody is having such feels for it and thinks that it's flawless? Well, so am I. It's the first and only film in my life I've actually got up, walked out, and asked for my money back. Not for no reason did I do this, though. So, this episode is dedicated to picking out all the things that are wrong with Days of Future Past. Yes, this is a shit show of a film, and it ruins everything that the previous film, X-Men First Class, built. It's a pity since First Class was arguably the best of all the X films, and it took a different direction by divorcing itself from the odd cobbled-together continuity of the first three X-Men films. It did its own thing. It was completely different in many ways from the established continuity in the comics, but what it did was consistent and worked fairly well, aside from a few small problems. The problem with Days of Future Past is that it completely hoses everything that First Class set up. In doing so, it makes it impossible to continue from where First Class left off, and makes it questionable why they even bothered to create a new continuity and a new series starting with First Class. Yeah, it was great to see McAvoy and Fassbender again, but did it need to be in such a bad movie? The bad direction is obvious, because otherwise good or even decent actors are giving very, very lacking performances. Jennifer Lawrence, who is generally okay, gives a phoned-in performance here. While that wouldn't necessarily be too noteworthy, also long-time veterans Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen give possibly the most wooden performances of their lives under the direction of Bryan Singer, to say nothing of Ellen Page, who is a talented actress, but who here gives absolutely no life to the character who takes place of Kitty Pryde. The script is terrible. It's inconsistent within itself, and it has all the hallmarks of because I said so scripting, like with shoehorning Stryker in, having Mystique somehow be in Saigon conveniently to move the plot, and pretty much the entire future storyline, which not only didn't make sense, but only happened that way because the script said so. It's incoherent, it's confusing, and surely most audiences just sat there and watched the impressive 3D, not trying to think too hard about the plot. As we've said before, Days of Future Past is a huge fuck you to First Class fans. 90% of the characters from First Class aren't brought back, and one gets the impression that it is simply because they were too cheap to get what amounts to glorified cameos from some of the people who were in the first three X-Men films, and couldn't be bothered to get the people back that made the previous films such a success. That kind of sucks, and it's very not classy. The original story, Days of Future Past, was one of the most important X-Men stories up to that point, because really that sort of thing hadn't been done. The original story's importance, however, was cheapened by the first X-Men film essentially wasting the Senator Kelly storyline. So what we have here is essentially a rehash of that storyline, except with other people replacing the original people, and the entire meaning underneath being thrown out in favor of, well, we don't know. Couldn't they have put Senator Kelly's father in here? I don't know. It seems dubious what they did do instead. The original story had a parallel to Nazi Germany. It was a very simple parallel and easy to understand. Moviegoers would have been able to get into this very quickly and very easily, but for some reason they decided not to pursue that. There is a ludicrous amount of involvement shoehorned in of real people, like Richard Nixon and JFK. There is also a line that is crossed when a throwaway comment obviously meant to get some chuckles or a knowing smile out of the audience deals with a real person's death. It's not funny and it's not appropriate. In fact, there's too much violence and too much disturbing content even for this story. The original comics managed to treat it with some element of dignity, even while everybody's dying all over the place. Even while there's the threat of a grim future where essentially a new Nazi power has triumphed. This film manages not to have even a fraction of the class that the original comic did, and this is a comic that was put out in the early 80s. There are also a number of anachronisms in the film, which may be nitpicking, but as someone who is very fond of the 60s and 70s in terms of history and cultural study, I couldn't help but notice that really the setting was just a vague, nebulous the 70s. There were a lot of things put together that didn't really go very well in the setting, and other things were shoehorned in to show, hey, it is the 70s. Unlike First Class, which tended to slide in its time-sensitive references fairly subtly, Days of Future Past shoves it in your face and says, hey, it's the 70s! Look, we really did the reading! We really did the research! Despite the fact that Days of Future Past actually happened in 1981. So, is no one going to mention that an unpowered dwarf scientist somehow manages to murder characters able to threaten the entire world individually because they were too cheap to get the actors back? If not, I'm gonna just mention that. This is a bad choice for any story, film or otherwise, and why get actors visibly and significantly older than they were in even just their latest previous appearances, instead of getting actors from the film just previous that would have looked pretty much the same? Yeah, I know you had to pay a lot for all those glorified cameos, but we could have had a smaller cast, or, I don't know, got back the people from First Class and did another story that didn't completely ass-fuck a classic story. Another thing to mention is the fact that First Class was trying to establish a series separate from the original X-Men films by removing it both in time and in characters. First Class was great because guess what? We didn't have a film where Wolverine was the central character. I know he has his fans, just like Spider-Man has his, but shoehorning him in as the main character really was not the thing to do. But he's not the only character who was oddly treated in Days of Future Past. Kitty Pryde and Rachel Summers were essentially merged, so we couldn't get someone else to play the small but crucial role that Rachel played in the original story. We had to just combine Kitty's power of phasing with somehow her being able to send people's minds back in time. Powers operate on themes or aesthetics. Typically, you don't have someone with two powers that have absolutely nothing to do with each other or the character. Even in the case of someone like Emma Frost, where her telepathy and her diamond form are very different powers, they fit the character instead of being made to merge together because they were too cheap to get someone else to play Rachel Summers. Kitty is also robbed of being the protagonist, which is a pretty shitty thing to do to her. So we couldn't have had Xavier running his school and having Kitty as one of the first new students, perhaps having her first Danger Room session, and then, just like in the comic book story, her mind comes back from the future and she has to stop something bad. No, we have to have Wolverine do it, because there's a contrived reason for Xavier to have no mental powers and thus not be eligible to be the hero for some reason. Yet isn't that kind of irrelevant, since, as we see, mental powers are not necessary for the transfer. Also, Xavier has already shown in the movies that he can transfer his own mind into another body. This isn't just a comic book thing. Even in the films, he has demonstrated he can transfer his own mind into someone else's body, and presumably would only need help with the time aspect. Magneto is further ruled out, yet we find out later that not only did he act honorably up to that point of history, the future mind also apparently replaces the past mind while it's there. So it would not have been a consideration at all for Magneto to be the hero. Bishop is introduced for no reason other than to be sidelined instantly. To say nothing of the fact that Xavier is somehow alive in the future despite being blown to atoms in X3. Magneto, similarly, is somehow heroic now, allied with Xavier, and cares again about Mystique despite basically kicking her to the curb in X3 and trying to kill her later in Days of Future Past, which should have been something that occurred before any of the original X-Men films. Wolverine is visibly older, and a throwaway line claims that he doesn't age, which isn't true. He ages slowly, but he does age. Wolverine also has serious mental problems that would make him an extremely bad choice, if not the worst choice, for temporal displacement that this film's plot requires. So you're gonna send back the guy who could lose his mind at any time, who has no grasp on his memories, and who has serious mental problems. Great idea. When he gets back, we find out that all of Xavier's students had been drafted. What, all one or two of them? Did they forget that most of the characters went with Magneto at the end of First Class? What about academic deferment, which they would have been eligible for? Why is Hank, who was a government scientist in First Class, just hanging out at the mansion? And why is it that no one questions where he is? Some backstory might have been good. Where is Moira? Even though Professor Xavier suppressed her memories at the end of First Class, why didn't he think of her when these problems were starting? He could have easily contacted her, restored her memories, and got her help to get the X-Men running again. Xavier, unfortunately, has been made by this script into a bratty asshole and spends most of his time whining and storming off in a huff, despite the fact that he is completely in the wrong all the time. No part of the script tries to make him likable. We're just supposed to assume that he's right because he's Professor Xavier. I'd also like to point out, Logan did not say fuck off in First Class, he said go fuck yourself. So even that attempt to link something back to First Class was about as half-assed as the rest of the film. As in First Class, it is obvious that Xavier is wrong almost all of the time, which was abundantly clear by the time they were in Cuba in First Class, but especially so now that giant killer robots have been unleashed against mutant kind. I think the promise of peaceful coexistence has kind of gone down the tubes by now, and I think we need to stop kidding ourselves. Quicksilver pops up and is a complete wasted presence outside of one singular scene that could have been handled by anyone else. He's also turned into Peter instead of Pietro, and, just like a couple of the other characters in First Class, is essentially robbed of his heritage by being Americanized and homogenized. The Sentinels are far too advanced for that period of time. I don't like to bring it up, but it's true. These were interesting robots, but they were giant robots, because the technology required even to conceive of something like the Sentinels would take a massive amount of space. Also, their giant size was part of what made them threatening. It's what made them scary. They're giant. They're terrifying. They're huge robots that from their size alone are imposing. They also operate on a false premise. Mystique cannot duplicate powers. She can only look like people. If she could duplicate powers, why does she just beat people up with martial arts? Why would it even matter? If she could duplicate everyone's power that she can duplicate the appearance of, why would she need to work with anyone? She could just easily use all the powers she wants to by shifting in between people with the powers she needs. Bye-bye backbone of the film. Did they think people couldn't handle an adapting technology? They can obviously handle tech far ahead of its time. The Sentinels are too small, not really imposing, they look stupid. To boot, there are some facts from the comics that kind of demolish the whole premise of the Sentinels, because the original Sentinels were not really able to adapt that well to various different powers. They were equipped with defense mechanisms and able to overpower with size and sturdiness. Only Nimrod and the Hunter-Killer Sentinels from the future have the ability to adapt. They weren't able to do that from the get-go, and certainly Bolivar Trask's Sentinels were not able to do that at all. Nimrod was important in the comics because he was able to adapt. He learned from every encounter. The Sentinels didn't tend to. Even Hunter-Killer Sentinels from the future were only able to adapt by being part of sort of a hive mind, and even that was a bit dodgy at times. Trask's Sentinel program is explicitly and decidedly turned down, yet his assassination is supposed to undo that? That's not how politics works. Bolivar Trask's physical condition will probably act against him in politics. It's a sad fact, but if this is supposed to be the early 1970s, as it was allegedly, that's something to consider. It's also not how assassinations work. Mystique can look like anyone, yet somehow they knew it was her? How? How did they also find her magically within an hour of her doing it? And how, as previously mentioned, did they derive Sentinel technology almost instantaneously from her genes when she is unable to imitate powers without technological help, only appearances? Additionally, Why did they presumably let her go, since we can assume this is supposed to take place in the X-Men films continuity when they didn't for any of the other mutants? Xavier whines constantly and is basically a giant asshole throughout the film, yet it's Magneto, Eric, who is constantly criticized and insulted whenever he brings up valid points. Is it any surprise when he kind of goes evil? But in reality, is it any surprise that he has a chip on his shoulder against Charles and the rest of the sort of X-Men? But even so, with no real provocation, he decides to go balls out evil, and we're supposed to assume, despite that, that everything is somehow better now in the ending. Wouldn't it just have been better if they had united against the threat of the Sentinels instead? Or maybe have the whole premise being undoing the events of the film, which have obviously gone too far from the beginning, and reset it so that the cast of First Class could have been brought back for the next film if they desired, and also they wouldn't have alienated all the fans of First Class by basically flipping them off. If you're going to ignore X3, ignore it entirely. Don't just half-ass ignore it and then claim your film is brilliant for undoing it, when all you're doing is undoing a far better film by poor choices of writing and questionable casting. And there you have it, plenty of talking points to defeat anyone who claims that Days of Future Past is some sort of amazing cinematic masterpiece. It did a good job with the 3D, that's about as far as I'm willing to go. Bad performances by otherwise good actors, and a questionable premise, as well as a laughably horrible script, and a huge screw you to fans not only of the film previous, but also the original story, doesn't rate many points with me. They could have done it better, they didn't. The potential wasted is what is so infuriating about it, and the fact that they had something good, and they let a hack waste it. Thanks, Bryan Singer. Let's hope you don't get to make X-Men Apocalypse, because if it is anything like Days of Future Past, that will be the end of the X-Men at the cinema. I can only hope. This has been Along Came a Podcast. I'm Hushcho. Check out my Patreon, and please subscribe if you like these episodes. I'll see you next time with another one. Follow me on social media if you haven't already. Bye-bye.